falling players to the game of the new world order. Don't be caught unaware when the heads start rolling. No, it couldn't happen here. I know it wouldn't happen here. But I will not submit to authority of man. I'm alive, I'm awake. This is more than I can take. If you had an open door, would you kill a little more? Listen to the cries of the dead in the wake of the Sudan. Is there no one out there? I see blood in the sands of despair in Africa. Listen to the sound of applause in a chamber full of men selling out their people as they plan their assault on the heart of America. No, it couldn't happen here. I know it never happened here. I will not submit to authority of man. I'm alive, I'm awake. This is more than I can take.
Yeah, and I think it's getting to be more than I can take too. Hi everybody, this is Chuck Horton, your host for Double Cross Radio, and I'm coming to you live from Southern Oregon. I was kicked out of the state of Jefferson. They said, you don't represent us, you can't call yourself state of Jefferson and whatever. So those guys are kind of fascists anyway, I guess. So I was always a Jefferson Republic guy anyway, so I'm not, my feelings aren't hurt. But that's how it is. And I'm coming to you live tonight. This is the 28th of January, and I'm coming to you with a very sad and heavy heart. Needless death of Mr. I'm sure I'm saying this right, Lincecum, who was gunned down by, I think it was FBI agents. Jordan Page has already written a beautiful ballad chronicling this. It's just fabulous lyrics. And I'm kind of sad to say that I haven't been following this as closely as I should have. Been very busy with work, and I've also, my main interest, as I've always told everybody, is history and economics. But this is just a sad thing that has happened, and it's really indicative of how little freedom we have in this world anymore. And the fact that we don't go by a constitution in this country, that law enforcement people can be a judge, jury, and executioner in a matter of minutes, and the man is not, an unarmed man with his hands above his head was gunned down. Let's just say it. And I think the person that shot this, the first shot, and everybody involved, is an accessory to murder, first degree. But there's no one with the balls in the state of Oregon to enforce the laws that they have against first-degree murder. So from Governor Kate Brown, of course she has no balls, she's a woman. I don't say that as a chauvinist, I say that as just, she's only concerned if gay rights are being trampled on. So if Mr. Lincecum was a gay man, then she would have been all over this. But since he's not, he's a proud heterosexual, she doesn't represent him. She's there for the gay lobby. We have the Oregon State Police. Well, they kind of serve at the pleasure of the governor, but still they're a law enforcement agency. And if they can't see this is a violation of the law, I don't know where their head is at. Well, I do know where it is at, but I'm not going to describe it on air. It's just, there is some decency left here. And then there's, of course, the sheriff in that county who is just probably crapping in his pants since this whole situation developed. The man has got no spine, no backbone, does not protect the people, and does not enforce the Constitution. And I tell you, there should be a recall election immediately. All you people out there in those counties, you should be starting this. You should be starting circulating petitions, and you should recall this sheriff and put somebody in there with a spine and backbone who will enforce the laws against murder. These FBI agents that conducted this operation are they are all guilty. This guy maybe did not maybe use the smartest strategies in the world. Certainly, he didn't end well for him at all. But I don't know how I'd react if people started shooting at me. And I'm reminded of a woman that made a bad turn in Washington, D.C. and turned into an area where she wasn't supposed to go, and they told her to stop, and she missed the brake and hit the gas, and it lurched forward in her car, and they riddled her car with bullets, killing her, and somehow miraculously not killing her baby. And they found out later she was just not a very good driver. That's a death sentence, I guess. And none of those people were ever punished for killing somebody who wasn't. And some people say, "Oh, this is because of some crazy white woman was attacked." No, she was a black woman. She was a dental hygienist. She had a good job. She had a nice car. She just wasn't a very good driver. And that's how it goes. I've made wrong turns before. Turned down a wrong way on a one-way street and go, oh, crap, and pull over and kind of wait for all the cars to go by and then slowly creep out and turn around and get going the right way again. It's happened to me before in my life more than once. I'm just lucky there weren't a bunch of FBI guys standing around because they would have just drilled me full of holes. By the way, they said only 3 shots were fired. Well over 200 rounds were fired in this instance. The car that this man was driving, which had 3 passengers, was riddled with bullets. And I just dare anybody to go out there and count all those bullet holes and tell me only 3 rounds were fired. The news is full of lies. It's just full of it. I just had a couple things I wanted to bring up about this. In May 1788, Thomas Jefferson wrote this, and this is probably one of the best quotes that Thomas Jefferson has ever been credited with, because it's true and it's a warning. And this is how it goes, quote, "The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and the government to gain ground." That's what's been happening. Our freedoms are being taken away. We're yielding and we're giving them up. Sometimes we're being tricked into giving them up by those people that are in power. They attack us. We have our own country attacking us so that they can impose more government control over our lives. Because 9/11 was not, it isn't anything that they said it was. And yet that's the excuse for the Patriot Act, which has been renewed and renewed, all based on a lie. It's liberty yielding, government gaining. At the time when he wrote this, Jefferson was living in Paris, serving as the minister to France. This is basically the ambassador, at a time when the United States was still in its infancy. It was during this time period that France descended into violent revolution. That's the kind of thing we don't want to see here in this country. I'm not a fan of violence to achieve your ends. I think it only produces the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. And so I never advocate for violence. France's reversal of fortune was legendary. Only a few years before, they were the largest superpower in the world and had helped the U.S. gain independence. In fact, I think without the support of the French, we would still be a British colony. Or we would have been a colony. Actually, Canada technically still is a colony. Do you guys understand that? That the Queen has the ability to veto any legislation that the Canadian Parliament passes? Yeah, I think I would call that still a colony. Yet now, not even a decade later, Jefferson watched as French peasants stormed the Bastille in 1789 and entered a 26-year period of chaos. He wrote extensively on the subject, and it clearly influenced his thinking on politics. For example, one of Jefferson's chief concerns was that the U.S. Constitution did not limit the number of terms someone could serve as U.S. president. To Jefferson, a president serving for multiple terms was tantamount to a monarchy. Or you could just have different branches of the same family, the Clinton monarchy and the Bush monarchy. They could just take turns occupying the office. But true to Jefferson's warning, liberty has yielded in the land of the free and most of the West, for that matter, and government has gained where liberty has yielded. Government now regulates what we can and cannot put in our own bodies. It regulates how we are allowed to raise our own children. They have awarded totalitarian control of the economy and money supply to an unelected central banking elite, which have in turn created epic bubbles in nearly every major financial market on the planet. We talked about some of those bubbles last week. Interest rates are negative in many parts of the world. If you don't know what a negative interest rate is, it's when you put, let's say you put $1,000 in the bank, and a year later you go to take it out and you realize there was a 1% negative interest rate on that and you get $999 back. That's a negative interest rate. Sometimes they'll hide it by telling you, well, there's a service charge for holding on protecting your money, or it's still a negative interest rate. Interest rates being negative, there is very little savings. Balance sheets are in pitiful condition. Capital controls are being rolled out. Debt levels are exploding. Pension funds are insolvent, and so are a lot of banks. How do you know if your bank's insolvent? Well, you better find out. If you don't know how to read a balance sheet, you better go and get some education on this, because it might mean a lot to you and your family to be able to get your money out of a bad bank and get it into a good bank. It may be a good idea to have it, maybe some of it offshore, out of the Federal Reserve System. Just saying. I think this is one of our very first shows we had on this Double Cross Radio show. One of our first shows, Drew and I were talking about how we don't keep more than we need to, absolutely need to pay our monthly bills. The things that you have to do through banking transactions, the rest of it we try and keep out of our banking accounts, because if banks go down, I mean, you're not going to be able to get your money out. What are you going to do? We posted on our Facebook page, we posted an interview of Bill Bonner, who I agree with most of what he said. I think this was an interview from about 4 months ago. And a couple of things that he said to do. If you would have followed his advice at the time, you'd been a little bit underwater right now. But I still think the guy was speaking truth, and most of what he said, he knows a lot more than I do. And I think that was, he was saying that some of the stocks in the Russian economy were cheap. You were buying them at super sale prices. Well, I think they're cheaper now. Well, maybe if you think Russia's going to be a stable economy, that'd be a place where you could put some of your money, the Russian stock market. I guess his theory was it can't go down much further. Your losses are limited, and your potential gains are really high. But I'm not so sure that I'm not giving you guys advice, because I'm not so sure I would do this myself. But just ask yourself, where do you think all this is going? Do you really think your home country will be more free and more prosperous 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Maybe 10. Go through a collapse and restructure, reorganization, may become, decide that they're going to go back to the freedom option. But if you don't think that 5 years is going to be a good times, let the good times roll period of time, and I'm certainly of that persuasion, you better have a plan B. And that's kind of what our show last week was about. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things you can do to help protect your assets, to make sure that you don't lose everything. And by the way, before I get too much further, I want to give a big thank you to Eric Dubin and News Doctors for his presence last week. He knows a lot more about these things than I do. He studies this stuff every single day, and he's able to put some weight where it should be. I mean, this is really serious. This is not so much, and that's that type of thing. And So some of the stuff I'm talking about, I have kind of a vivid imagination sometimes, and I see it as, well, this could be really, it could be disastrous. He says, well, there's this and this and this to kind of counteract that. And I go, oh, okay. I get over the top alarm, I guess is the right way to say that, about how serious the situation we face is. And it is very serious. Nothing that I have stated as a fact is untrue, but sometimes I put more weight on it than it deserves. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that, no one knows exactly what the future will bring. And to emphasize that, I have an example. In the mid-1920s, noted economist Ludwig von Mises, one of my personal heroes, stated that banking and stock markets were going to crash, that that the banks had caused these bubbles, and that they had and the rise that had been experienced was not due to increasing production or profitability, but instead to monetary expansion by the central banks. And that was about 1924, if I remember correctly, that he said this. I read it a couple of days ago. That's why I'm saying if I remember this correctly. I did not know the exact date until a couple of days ago. And I heard, I was listening to a podcast, Tom Woods' podcast, and he was interviewing somebody that was referencing this incident. One of Mises' students, Fritz Machlup, recalled Mises' gift of prophecy. As his assistant in the university seminar, which met every Wednesday afternoon, I usually accompanied him home. On these walks, we would pass through a passage of the Kriegsanstalt in Vienna. That was one of the largest banks in Europe. From 1924, every Wednesday afternoon, as we walked through the passage for pedestrians, he said, "That will be a big smash." Mind you, this was from 1924 onwards. Yet in 1931, when the crash finally came, I still held some shares of this bank, which of course had become completely worthless. So after 7 years, he listened to Mises tell him it can't last, it's going to crash, it's going to be just, it's going to be over. And he didn't divest himself of all of his stock. In the summer of 1929, Mises was offered a high position at this bank. His future wife, Margaret, was ecstatic, but von Mises surprised her when he decided against it. "Why not?" she asked. His response shocked her. "A great crash is coming, and I don't want my name in any way connected with it." He preferred to write and teach. "If you want a rich man," he said, "don't marry me. I am not interested in earning money. I am writing about money, but will never have much of my own." So he not only was correct about all that, he was correct about his personal finances too. That people who rule this world, they're not interested in allowing people who speak the truth to speak very much or to have much prosperity or notoriety. Yet he dedicated his life to bringing the truth on these matters to the public, and now even from the grave, he's a better economist than almost every living economist. Because he's writing, I'll tell you about that a little later on in the show. That's a little teaser about something coming up here. So Mises was correct about the coming economic upheaval, but he was a bit premature. And I think sometimes I'm in that same category. I can see the potential for some real harm to be done, and it worries me and scares me. I come out here and I talk about it because I have great affection for humanity as a whole, and I don't want you guys to fall into the same traps that people have fallen into every time we have this kind of situation where the central banks are debasing their currencies. But once von Mises saw that the current system was going to crash, he tried to alert others, just as I try to, but he was right, and being 5 years early, may have been his one fault, but I think it's better to be 5 years early than to be one day too late. And that's my philosophy on economic matters. It's why I tend to be a little dramatic about possible future consequences of actions being taken today and that were taken in the recent past. And I probably owe a lot of this to the frequent appearances by Jeff Berwick on our show, the Dollar Vigilante. He really woke me up. And there's historic examples of these kinds of economic crashes caused by banks inflating money supplies over and over and over again in history. And you think that somebody would learn, but they don't. They always manage. History books are written by people who want to manipulate how and what we learn from history, and they always seem to manage to blame it on something else. But it's really these rich elites. They're like the ancient feudal lords who had, not that ancient, the feudal lords of the Middle Ages in Europe, who lived by the sweat and labor of the serfs that they more or less owned. They weren't technically owned, but where else would they go? They go from nearly starving to absolutely starving. No, they stayed there and they produced harvests, and they got to keep a small portion of it, enough to live on. And the lord did nothing but to, feast on the proceeds of his estates. And that is kind of what the central bankers do today. They don't produce anything other than print money. And they do a crappy job of that because they're so greedy. They're not satisfied with just having a superior living without having to really work for it. No, they want to have everything. And so they keep debasing the currency until it collapses. And then suddenly they have the fear, we're going to lose everything. And they backtrack a little bit and they find someone else to blame it on, and then they go right on with their past behaviors of debasing currency. Now, it's my firm belief that the endless currency creation by central banks around the world has to eventually lead to higher gold prices. And that's one of the first predictions that I made on this show, and it hasn't come to pass yet. In fact, since I made that prediction, the price of gold has actually gone down. I believe that it's gone down because of market manipulations. In fact, I don't just believe that. I'm pretty much sure of it. But that's an economic prediction that I made that hasn't happened yet. Yet I think that that's still going to happen. Just I don't know when. And I think that if you're buying gold today or tomorrow or next week or next month, it's still better to be 3, 4, 5, even 10 years early than to start to try and buy gold when the currency you're holding in your hand won't buy a ham sandwich. And so, this view I have isn't my own, that I got just from thinking on my own. I got it from listening to people that know a lot more than I do, and that's kind of one of the things that I recommend to people. And some people are self-proclaimed experts, and there are people who I consider are experts. I tend to favor the ones that understand the nuances of Austrian economics, and people like Max Kaiser, Peter Schiff, Gerald Celente, and none of those guys aren't always in total agreement with everything either. But they're all pretty much in agreement about gold. In fact, I could probably go on and list another dozen people, like Rick Rule. There's a lot of them. Doug Casey, Jeff Berwick, Simon Black, all these people. They all are saying pretty much the same thing. There's only so much gold in the world. We've quadrupled the amount of cash that's out there. The demand for gold is greater than ever. It should go up. It's not going up because the markets are being manipulated. And I think that someday they'll discover how they're doing this, and someone will go to prison. And if it's somebody in China, they'll have their head chopped off. So just as with von Mises being too early on his predictions and being too early when you're starting to buy gold is still a better deal than trying to buy it with your worthless currency. And I want to tell you, if you want to have a close look at what it's going to look like when things start to collapse, you can look at what's going on in Brazil right now, or recently happened in Argentina, where their currencies kind of collapsed. Its currencies collapsed probably in this century, in the last 20 years. in my lifetime, currencies in Mexico have collapsed at least 3 times. And you can go back and read about what happened during those collapses, about how the Mexican peso did not have enough value to purchase gold or silver anymore. And it didn't last forever. Eventually the economies recover and things start to go back to normal. But there's a period of time, it could be from 2 to 4 years, where living's pretty sketchy. And in the United States, this bubble that has been created here is much bigger than any of those bubbles. And the devastation and damage it's going to do is going to be much greater than these people experienced. This is people in a lot of these countries, emerging nations, and maybe somewhere between second and third world nation status. A lot of the people still produce their own food. They kind of live like a modern day serf almost. And so they're, the fact that the currency doesn't buy as much doesn't affect them as much as it will in a place like the United States, where people have no skills, no survival skills. They have no ability to grow food. They don't know anything about nutrition. They could tell you what somebody's batting average is, but that's not going to get you anything. That knowledge isn't going to be useful. They might know how to, they might know who's going to be the finalist on the, on The Voice, but big deal. That information isn't going to be worth anything to anybody. The things they know aren't important, I guess what I'm going to say. Oh, I turned the page over too fast. Here we go. So, I'm going to check in here on the chat and see how these guys are doing. Okay. So you guys in chat, you tell me if I'm still coming in loud and clear. I have no sound coming in on UCY today, so I don't know if I'm doing well or not. And I don't know what the deal is, but I'm going to blame it on Ghost in the Machine. We'll see. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, Argentina had a recent collapse. And they also had a collapse back in 1959. Now, back in this period, I was 8 years old then, so I don't remember much of this. I remember the name Juan Perón. He was a bad dude. He was a fascist, kind of a populist fascist, kind of like I think Donald Trump would be. And his wife, I think, was maybe it was his daughter. There was another Perón that carried on his legacy and was not much better, if not anything, maybe a little worse. But they would kind of ruin the economics of Argentina because of their lack of using good economic policy would stimulate growth and wealth creation and those types of things. And so there were a lot of people there that were really struggling to make ends meet, and a group of people from the University of Buenos Aires invited Ludwig von Mises. Yeah, the guy I was talking about earlier. He was still around then. He was still relatively, he wasn't really a young man by then, but he was not really old. But they invited him to give a guest lecture at the university on economic policies. And for this lecture, hundreds of students, educators, and grandees. I'm not sure what a grandee is, but it's some kind of a Spanish significant. It's like somebody that's working with the university. I didn't look it up, but I was trying to get the meaning of it out of the context. What is this? Something associated with the university. They filled the lecture hall where he delivered his speech. In fact, there were so many people that turned out for this. It was much more than they expected. They had to use 2 adjacent rooms and pipe sound into those rooms from his lecture in the main lecture hall, which was quite large. There were just literally hundreds of people there. This is just at a university. This is for somebody that probably he's among the top 5 economists that ever lived, in my mind. And he was so hated by the mainstream and the ruling elites that they never awarded him a Nobel Prize. In fact, no Austrian economist ever won a Nobel Prize until after Mises had died. That's how weird these people are that rule the world. Anyway, Perón, being the populist that he was, had always held that his economic policies were were there to support, empower, and uplift the population, but they had caused the exact opposite to occur. And Mises was there to deliver a message of hope. In his speech, he made emphasis on the things that truly empower and uplift people. It was a tribute to free market capitalism. In the history of the world, nothing has done more to improve the day-to-day lives of people around the world than capitalism. And it's not a perfect system. It's probably never been tried in its purest form, but it's the best system that's ever come down the road. And for all the things that aren't quite right with it, I think we've been unwise to tinker with our capitalist system here in the United States. It's bringing us a lesser quality of life, a lower standard of living, and it's almost like we're sinking in quicksand. The harder we struggle, the further we sink. Anyway, this economic system of capitalism is just based on a real simple principle, which is that there's private ownership of property and the means of production. That's it. It's pretty simple. Private ownership of property and the means of production. And to demonstrate this, he compared the current plight of the Argentinians to that of serfs in the feudal system, just as I had earlier today. In fact, I kind of got that idea from reading this article at Mises Institute about the feudal system. And they also had this story in here, which I've kind of paraphrased. By the way, Dan Sanchez was the author, and it's an awesome, awesome article, Dan. Everybody should read it. So anyway, this feudal system had been in place in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, which was a long time, maybe 1,000 years. And it was pretty pathetic. I mean, if you were born a serf, you were going to live a serf and die a serf. If you were born a noble, then you were probably guaranteed a pretty nice life. You got to live at the expense of the serfs. You didn't really have to do anything. A lot of them had other hobbies. In Poland, the land my wife is from, there was one of the noblemen was quite famous horse breeder. We were able to visit their mansion estate. It's humongous. It's like, it's a huge estate. Anyway, inside his estate is a full horse racetrack, and you have stables and pastures for horses. He really loved horses, and that was what he did. And the serfs in that surrounding area, they labored and toiled and lived and died. And by him being the nobleman there, he was entitled to everything, so much from every serf family. They were able to keep enough to live on. That was about it. And this is you can't believe how fabulous this palace was. It wasn't really. It's just more like just huge mansion. It's enormous, and like I said, the estate was enormous. There's a lot of houses there where the servants lived, and they've remodeled and refitted those houses. And a lot of people who are artists and writers, they'll go there on a retreat so they can enjoy the peaceful surroundings and the beautiful estate that they're on, and they'll stay there for a month or two while they're doing their creative pursuits of painting or writing or whatever. That's just how life was. So you could kind of get a hint of what it was like to be a nobleman. But there's for every nobleman there had to be thousands of serfs. And anyway, that was that. So, I compare that a lot to our, I see these central banks and the banksters that are involved in that. I see them as being similar to the feudal lords, and that they live at the expense of everybody else. They don't produce anything. I have no problem with a corporation that owns, they own and manufacture, they own a plant and they manufacture something like automobiles. And they enrich themselves through producing things that other people want. That's okay. I don't think Bill Gates is that great a guy, but he is producing things that other people want. He's not just, stealing money from people by debasing the currency that he's supposed to be, backing. So anyway, I think that there's a lot of similarities, even in America today. And von Mises had no trouble convincing the people in Argentina that they were being used like the serfs of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages in Europe. During this time in that feudal system, there were 90% of the population was engaged in the production of food. The lives of the serfs were spent in daily labor, producing a tiny bit more than they needed to survive, and the excess going to their parasitical landlords, the dukes, barons, and other noblemen. People were born into the life that they were to lead until they died. And that was just it. Then in the 17th century, a new form of economic organization emerged, and you guessed it, it was capitalism. If you didn't guess it, shame on you. Yeah, listen closer. So I've given you this answer several times so far in the program. Mises conceded that it wasn't, and in describing capitalism to his audience, he conceded that it wasn't a completely free market, but there were enough aspects of such in the new capitalism that it vastly improved the lives of millions of peoples around the world. As Mises explained, there were four main characteristics. I just give them to you here. I'll describe them briefly after I give you all four of them. One was dynamic production. Two was consumer sovereignty. Three was mass production. And four was prosperity for the people. Now, we're not going to have a test on this. You're not going to be graded, but I thought we should go through and kind of describe what these really mean, so you understand this. And when someone starts to tell you, but capitalism is evil, it's just, it's just for the rich people, it's for the elites. But no, that's fascism pretending to be capitalism. That's the Donald Trump way. True free market capitalism, there's competition, and people who start to act like criminals in the corporate world or in the private enterprise of just owning their own business, if they don't do it honorably and whatever, bad news travels fast, and their business will be severely limited, and competition will allow other people to take market share from them. And that's how it's supposed to work. But when you have a lot of money and you can bribe government officials to create laws that create barriers to entry into the market system, you can kind of do what you want and tell other people just to bugger off. You can be a Monsanto. You can say, well, we're going to, I don't care if you have a ban on this pesticide in our Roundup in your country. We're going to have this Trans-Pacific Partnership passed, and your country's going to sign on to it. And if you don't let us come in with Roundup, you're going to be in violation of this pact that you signed on to, and you're going to have to pay us a fee for keeping us out of your country. So there. And guess, they're a big proponent of that because they know they're going to make a lot of money killing people in these other countries with their poisonous Roundup. Well, that's how fascism operates. Capitalism couldn't ever work that way. First of all, a government probably wouldn't be banning a product from their shores, but again, they wouldn't allow someone to come in there and put a product on the land that actually harms people if it's destructive to their property, whatever. They could find the people that are producing that product guilty. They're destroying property, they're destroying lives, and imprison them, which would kind of tend to keep them in check. I don't think you need to have anything more than just laws that protect property and life, period. So, on to more about all these four factors. These are the four main characteristics. Now, dynamic production isn't I want to point out these are characteristics of a free market capitalism, and depending on how free the market is, and then we know that none of them are totally free, but they may be expressed to a greater degree in one place than they are in another, but they tend to be kind of common among places where they have capitalism. The first, dynamic production. Now, this is really a simple concept to us today, but to a serf in feudal Europe, this was revolutionary. Dynamic production, simply put, enables free entrance in the market and free exit as well. And you're saying, what are you talking about? We take this for granted. Hey, I'm going to start a business. I won some money in the lottery. I think I'm going to buy a bar and I'm going to start a business. And that's dynamic production. That is free entry into the marketplace. And then, you do that for a while. You say, this just wasn't quite the life I wanted. I want to get out of this. And so you sell your bar and you go on to something else. That's a free exit. To the serfs in Europe, it meant that if they could somehow manage to save a little bit of money, they could go off to the city and get a job which would provide more income than they could possibly make on a farm. And that happened in Europe. It also was happening in the United States. And later on, at a later time, we weren't really under serfdom, but the farmers had to have large families in order to work the land. And unfortunately, as it got time for mom and dad to pass on, there wasn't enough farm for everybody in the family to have some. So a lot of the family would just exit that economic activity and head for the cities, for the factories were being formed from the Industrial Revolution. So that was an aspect of, in fact, I don't think the Industrial Revolution could have taken place without this capitalist organization of society. It just wouldn't have happened. Let's see, another way to think of dynamic production is liberty. The increase in freedom was expressed in economic terms as dynamic production, and the resulting increased wealth creation demolished the existing caste systems. So no longer, if you were born into poverty, were you doomed to be in poverty for your entire life. There was a way out. And not everybody made it out, but a lot of people did. And that's why we had an emerging middle class, a class that had never existed before. And this is a quote from the article. Production, formerly adrift in the standing water of feudalistic stagnation, set sail into the capitalistic dynamism driven by the bracing winds of competition. That's something else that occurred. It wasn't planned. It just occurred that suddenly there was competition. There were people who were producing things were competing for customers. And that brings us to number 2, customer sovereignty. Now, this is the logical end to this system where the producers vie for consumers. When this occurs, prices go down and production often goes up. And this is a quote from von Mises. This is from a speech he gave at this guest lecture he had in Argentina. And talking about modern captains of industry and leaders of big business, they call a man a chocolate king or a cotton king or an automobile king. Their use of such terminology implies that they see practically no difference between the modern heads of industry and those feudal kings, dukes, or lords of earlier days. But the difference is in fact very, very great. For a chocolate king does not rule. He does not reign over conquered territory, independent of the market, independent of his customers. The chocolate king, or the steel king, or the automobile king, or any other king of modern industry depends on the industry he operates and on the customers he serves. This king must stay in the good graces of his subjects, the consumers, or he loses his kingdom as soon as he is no longer to do this. His customers, as soon as he is no longer in a position to give his customers better service and provide it at lower cost than others with whom he must compete. So you see how this dynamic production leads to consumer sovereignty, and it leads to the people that are at the top are actually serving the people that they employ, whatever. It's Henry Ford said it very awkwardly, and he said, I need to pay my people more so they can afford the products that they make for me. Well, that's another way of saying it, but it's not exactly economically true. He pays us cheaper to pay people more and retain them as employees. He got that side benefit of them being able to purchase his product. He was actually serving his customers by paying his workers more money and enabling him to turn out better products, more products that were uniformly superior. So that was kind of what Henry Ford was trying to say. When you hear that quote, sometimes you remember that you heard it explained a little differently here first. So, in other words, that's. I'm kind of running short on time. I better hurry up here. That was the second aspect of capitalism that was pretty apparent. It seems to be uniform every time it improved license. But here's a third one: mass production for the masses. Mises pointed out that a capitalist's main route to becoming one of those few wealthy consumers of extraordinary means is through mass-producing wares that cater to the masses of consumers or of ordinary means. Here in Medford, we used to have a place called North's Chuckwagon. It was a kind of a there's lots of places that kind of copied that since then. Maybe he was copying somebody else. I don't know, but he was a friend of my grandmother's, and he would often come into the family jewelry store and purchase things for his wife for Christmas. And he told me one day when I heard I was going off to college, he says, well, remember this because they won't teach you this in college. If you want to be a rich man, if you want to live with the classes, the people that have money, you have to sell to the masses. And if you don't, you're going to live with the masses and serve the classes. And I thought, what the heck does that mean? And I never forgot it. And as I've gone through life, I've found it to be very, very true. So it doesn't matter what the per unit profit margin is. If it's multiplied by enough people, it's a huge profit. And, people who are employing this strategy today would include Walmart. They try and they kind of do it some unscrupulous ways, but they want to go just to the dead center of the bell curve. They want to go to the center of the bell curve and maybe a couple standard deviations on either side of it. They want their marketing to encompass as many people as possible, and it doesn't matter if they have a slim margin if they're able to sell to enough people. Now, that is a very telling, and it's a very common aspect or common characteristic of a capitalist system. Now, to be fair, there are other places in the world where they have or they attempt mass production, but they don't always work out so well. I think I've told this story before, but there's in the former Soviet Union, they had these factories that made nails, but they were always having nail shortages. So in order to have more mass production and have it fit the needs of the people that were actually using the nails, they decided they needed to give incentives. So they told them that they would get a bonus if they were able to produce nails and the tonnage was, the amount that they produced in terms of sheer weight was over a certain amount. Well, so all the people making nails switched to making nails that were basically more like a railroad spike than a nail. They were unusable by anybody unless you were putting railroad spikes in the ground for the railroad. So they were basically unusable. They weren't being marketed to the masses. They were being incentivized, artificial incentives, instead of actually having true market forces. So these people says, we need to have it actually be the number of nails they produce, not just how much they weigh. So they changed it. They would incentivize them. They get so much of a bonus per every 100,000 nails they produced. So they started making all these little tiny, tiny nails that were, again, useless. And so that was how, when these other economic organizations or these organizing philosophies try and copy some of the characteristics of a successful capitalist system, they kind of don't understand how important those market forces are. The market forces are that communication from the consumer to the producer, and the producer back to the consumer. And as such, that's kind of the engine that drives capitalism. As Mises' address implied, the yearned for people power, always promised by demagogues like Perón, but which invariably turns to ashes in the mouths of the masses, as it did with the Argentinians, is a natural result of capitalism, a system so often derided as economic royalism. So all these other people promise these results, but only capitalism delivers on them. Just imagine you're sitting here in this auditorium, this lecture hall, and you're hearing this man tell you that everything that Perón told you is possible, but not with his system of governance, his economic system, the way of organizing society. Unless you have freedom in your markets, none of this is possible. He's just telling you that so you think that, yeah, we can have everything they have in this country over here where they have a freer economy. And you wonder why it doesn't happen. And he always has a convenient scapegoat to name it. In Germany, Hitler was blaming it on the Jews. In Argentina, I don't know who Perón blamed it on, but he found some scapegoats to blame it on. It was, and eventually these blames, they sometimes get to the point where they instigate wars. Capitalism has this charming arrangement of empowering the working person while still preserving economic sanity by placing means, that's the factors of production like labor, at the service of ends, that's consumer demand, instead of the insanity of doing the opposite, as the labor fetish of syndicalism does. So, to explain this a little bit better, this is kind of an important thing. Capitalism, meaning it's just freedom, it places the means of production, that's like in a sense like labor, or you could also say there's other parts of that too, but the means of production are at the service of the ends, the consumers. So if you aren't producing something that somebody wants, you're just on a fool's errand. There is no currently running for president in the Democrat Party is this insane socialist Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders thinks that he believes with all his heart in the labor value of products, the labor theory, or the theory of labor imposed value. In a sense, he's saying that labor has a certain value or cost, which is going to be determined by somebody who doesn't produce anything, and that cost goes into the making of something, and that cost is then going to be paid for by the consumer. And that's about as backwards as it gets. And people should really understand this. He's getting a lot of support. He's probably going to beat Hillary in Iowa and New Hampshire. I don't know where he'll go from there. And that would mean, it's about 20% of the population thinks that he's right on the nose with this stuff. Where have we gone as an education nation that our young people are so economically illiterate that they fall for this kind of crap? Nothing is worth anything unless somebody else says it is to them. In other words, when I produce something, if nobody thinks it has any value, it has no value. It doesn't matter how long I worked or how hard I worked or anything else. Once we've established that there's a large demand for something, we can start working labor into our calculations for profit and loss. But as Henry Ford found out, it's really expensive to retrain people if they're working for you to produce these things. So there really is no reason to trap people in their job. They have dynamic production. They're free to enter and free to leave whenever they want. And so people who are good business people, when they see people that have talent and that are good workers, that are a plus to their business, they want to keep them. So they inherently would like to pay them as much as they possibly can and still profit. It's just that's the way freedom works. When you force them to pay a minimum wage, and people aren't necessarily good enough workers to be worthy of a minimum wage, then they won't get hired. They'll get fired for other reasons. They'll find a reason to fire them. And so we'll have higher unemployment because some people just aren't worth $15 an hour. In fact, quite a few of them aren't. I only have one person besides myself actually there's two that are probably worth $15 an hour. I think all of them are worth something close to that, but not that much. They don't produce that much in the store. And for those of you who have never owned a business, try owning a business first before you start telling us how everybody deserves to have this much money. There are some people that just flat out don't. Okay. The fourth aspect or characteristic that's common to capitalist societies is that it not only empowers the working person, but it lifts them up. It uplifts them. Capitalism, as its name implies, is characterized by capital investment, which was the solution to the crisis of how marginal millions of 18th century England and the Netherlands were to integrate into the economy and survive. And when they say the marginal millions of these people, there were literally, this is a time of Dickens' stories written about the orphanages and everything. There were millions of people on the verge of starvation. Capitalism, what it would do, see, when you're going to, let's say you're in a shipbuilding business and you're going to build a ship for somebody, it's going to take you 6 months. Well, if you're going to put people to work in this, you have to pay them for that 6 months until the ship is finished and you get paid by them. So you have to invest capital into them in order to produce the product that you're going to eventually get paid for. So that fact that you are paying people before the product is done, that enriches those workers because they do not have the means to do this themselves. And they're able to get a better life than they had before. Or because of the dynamic production, they can just leave. And so anyway, he went on, and he was in his speech, but he was appalled by the anti-capitalist agitators who were falsified history. Whoops! My music's starting. I knew I wasn't going to quite get this all in. Anyway, you can read this. It's called Mises in 4 Easy Pieces at Mises Institute, and I recommend that. And thank you all for listening tonight. See you next week with another great show. And have a good week, and check out Jordan Payne's new song on YouTube, The Ballad of Lavoy Finscombe.
You're bound to break.